Okay, back in Photoshop, just a regular 8x10 image, 300 ppi, rectangle. I've got a drawn marquee rectangle out in the middle. I want to actually put guidelines around it. To get to the guidelines, you have to have your rulers showing. So if they're not, up to the view menu, down to check mark next to the word rulers. Your rulers will now show. Click on one of your rulers and drag out a guideline and put one. They snap to the marquee rectangle or rectangle tool. So I'm just going to drag them out so that they snap to those edges. Perfect. And then I'm going to add, let's see, I'm going to hit Command D to deselect. I've got my edges here so I can go back to this again. I'm going to invert this. I want a black background instead of a white one. So to get to the black background, I take it back. We're going to cover it. That's what we'll do. Let's add a blank new layer. So to add a new blank layer on top of this, it's the little icons on the bottom of your layers palette. The second one in from the right, the one right next to the garbage can, the square with a little plus in it, will create a new blank layer. You can tell it's blank because it's got that sort of checkerboard appearance to it. The reason we're seeing white is because the eyeball for the background is on. But nonetheless, with the background layer selected, hit the D key to default your foreground and background colors to black and white. To fill this layer with my foreground color on both Windows and Mac, it's Option Delete or Option Backspace, and it fills it with complete black. Then again, I'm going to do a selection, my marquee tool selection, and this time I'm going to do it inside my guidelines. So the M key gives you the marquee selection tool. It too is sticky, so if you get really close to the corners and simply drag it out, it will actually bring it out exactly the way that it should right here. And I'm going to jump this thing to its own layer, Command J. So when we do Command J, if I turn off the black background layer, you can see that the square perfectly fills that little rectangle that's delineated by those guidelines, which is exactly what we would expect to have happen. However, now I'm going to go back to my black layer, the solid black layer. I'm going to turn it on again. I'm going to load the selection that is this square. Now, I could draw it out with the marquee again, but I've already got it made in my layer 2. So if you simply hover over the thumbnail of your layer 2, hold down the Command key and click once, it'll load that very same thing as the selection, which is great. It's no problem for us at all. What I want to do now is I don't want another copy of the center. I want the entire surround. I want to see what the everything except this looks like. So to do that, I'm going to invert the selection up to the Select menu, down to Inverse. Again, I'm not inverting the image. If I were to invert the image, Command I does this. Again, it changes everything from white to black and black to white. So that's why that actually changed. That's not what I want to do. I want to invert the selection. So Select menu down to Inverse, and you can see we now have marching ants going around the entire exterior of the image as well as this area right here. I'm still working on my layer number 1, and I'm going to jump this to its own layer, Command J. And then I'm going to turn off the black layer, and I don't need to worry about the white layer. And I'm going to hit Command H to temporarily hide the guidelines. Now, if you take a look at my screen here really quick, this may or may not be happening on yours. You can see I've got a small white line that's actually on the left and the bottom side of this. This has to do with the screen redraw magnification. I am zoomed into 50% here. 50%, as a matter of fact, everything except for 100% in Photoshop, when it's drawn on your screen, is an illusion. It's not the real thing. It's supposed to be, it's an emulation of it. And sometimes you run into these anomalies like this. Those white lines are actually not there. To prove that, I'm going to come right over here on the, well, I'm going to bring my guides back. Command H brings them back. And I'm going to zoom into this corner where that problem was. And I'm going to go to a 100%. So this is the corner right here that was that 100%, and I'm going to again hide my guidelines, and you can see I have no vertical or horizontal line. It all has to do with just the illusion of the zoom part of it all. So as I zoom back down, you'll see the lines come back again, and they're sitting right there. It's not that they're there, they won't print that way, but just so that you guys understand that's what's going on. However, in looking at this, we have what I call a perfect dovetail in this. And what it means by that is that the little square that is in the middle perfectly fits the edges of the hole that's around the outside. Does that make sense, what I'm talking about here? So the square perfectly fits inside the frame that goes around it. And they were made from the same thing. I did the square first, and then I loaded the square, inverted the selection, and did the same thing again. And the two fit perfectly together. And that's how you would imagine it to be in Photoshop. You would think that, of course, that's exactly how it should work, right? So try this. Turn off both of those. Actually, let's put both of those into a group. So I'm simply going to select both of them. In the three little lines drop-down menu that's all the way to the far right-hand side of the layers palette, click on the drop-down here and say that you want to create a new group from layers. It'll put both of those layers into this group, and I'm going to just call this selection 1. And say OK to that. We're going to do the same trick again. I'm going to bring back my guidelines. So Command H brings back the guidelines. I am going to again hit the marquee tool, the M tool, and I am going to click and drag it out. And I'm going to turn on my black layer and make my black layer active. But this time, instead of having a perfectly hard line here, I'm going to feather this edge. And again, feathering the edge is simply going to blur this. So I'm going to come up to the Select menu, and I'm going to come down to Modify, down to Feather, and I'm going to put in a feather of 20 pixels and say OK to that. And then I'm going to jump that to its own layer, Command J. I'm going to turn off the background layer so that you can see what's going on. And if we zoom in and take a look at this, you can see that the edge got actually softened when we actually feathered that. And so what it's really doing is it's saying, okay, well, the original one, we were sharp right up to this guideline right here. We were solid black to the guideline, and then the minute that we went beyond that guideline, we went to solid white. But now that I've feathered that edge, there's actually a transition that happens in that now. So before I even reach that line, it starts going into dark grays, and then it continues past that line into light grays, and then finally out to white. So that's basically what's going on in here. However, you would think that this should not make a problem. So we're going to do the same thing that we actually did before. I'm going to load this as a selection. So hover over the thumbnail of the softer version of this, hold down the Command key and click to load it as a selection. I'm going to do the very same thing we did before. I'm going to invert my selection. So up to the Select menu, down to Inverse. Again, I'm going to zoom all the way out so you can see that there are the marching ants are on the outside. I'm going to go back to my black layer, turn it on, and I'm going to jump this to its own layer. Same exact thing that we did before. Command J, and then turn off this layer. And what you can see, I'm going to hit Command H to turn this out, is you have this line that's actually happening here in between the two. If you bring the guidelines back on, you will actually see that they fall right in the very middle of where this is happening. And what's going on here is this. It's probably going to be easier to, actually I think I may have a illustration of this on our website. It is. So in session 5 on our website, there's a thing called the selection dovetailing problem. That's exactly what we're dealing with here. It's this dovetailing problem. And this is what actually ends up happening is if we take a look at, let's say this is our top selection right here, and this is the inverse of it, our bottom selection right here. What ends up happening is that in the original version of our jump, it ended up being the perfect dovetail because we were only dealing with either 0% or black or 100%, which would be white. So on a scale of 0 to 100 from black to white, that's what we're really dealing with here. But the way Photoshop interprets transparency is we end up in the beginning of this scale. So if you take a look at these two scales, this would be the first one selection that we made right here. This would be the second selection that we made right here. When these two are multiplied together or put together, what they end up doing is, again, multiplying one another. So In the darkest area and the lightest area, that is not a part of it. That's not a problem right here. So if we take this area right here and we call this area in our scale right here 0% and this scale right here 100%, it doesn't matter which direction you do this in. 0 of 100% is 0. 100% of 0 is 0. So regardless, you get 0. The same thing happens at the opposite end of this. 100% of 0 is 0. 0% of 100 is also 0. The problem that we get into in the middle, though, is if you do 50% of 50, you do not get 0. 50% of 50 is still 25%. So you end up at the edges, you get what you would expect. But in this middle area right here, you get a transition of mid-tones or lighter, sort of like more three-quarter tones as a consequence of this. Does this make sense what's going on? Are we sort of getting that part? So if we go back and look at our image here, when I did this original one right here, this transition, this area right in here, so for instance, if I hover my cursor right over that line, you can see that I'm getting a readout of 130. And that's basically a middle gray. That's what you would expect to be there. When I actually add, I'm going to show the other version of it too. Now this is actually the inverse part of it, and I actually come up and look at him. That is way off. No, actually that's not. I'm just zoomed way in. So this is my, let me make sure I don't have anybody else on. Yeah. So this area right in here, again, if I come up onto this, that is not showing that at all where that should be. All right. I am not getting any readout at all. And that's weird because I had it before. All right, hang on one sec. Huh. Let's try this. Better. We'll put a white up underneath behind it. So the transparency part is throwing me here. All right, so back to this. So right on that spot, I'm getting a basically 125. Anyway, it's going to be close to middle gray here. When I add the other part to it here, what I end up getting is a middle gray multiplied against a middle gray. So 50% of 50 would be 25%. And if you look at our scale here, that's exactly what it is. Our readout here is giving us a 64, which is the first of the three-quarter tones. So we go from 0 to 64 is a quarter tone, to 128 is a mid-tone, half, to 192 is the top quarter tone, and it's 255. Does that make sense what's going on here? So the reason this edge is not perfectly dovetailed is because Photoshop treats the opposite of it as 50% of 50%, not 50% of 100%. And therefore the result is this. So very long way to get around to explaining why we saw that dovetail that I was talking to you guys about. So I just wanted you to understand that that is to be expected. We're going to run into it ourselves. You're going to see it. Okay, so with that, we are going to do Sunny as quickly as we can. Again, you don't need to turn this in today, but this will be due for your homework next week. My suggestion is that you start with a brand new copy of Sunny. Do not start with something you've already worked on. If you end up with something in your original version of Sunny that ends up better than what we do here today, there's nothing to stop you from simply dragging that layer into the version that we're working on today. I guess what I'm trying to say is, let's say that you had one layer that was just done spectacularly from the assignment that was due last week, and what you do today is nowhere near as good. There's nothing to stop you from stealing that layer from the one that you did last week and bringing it into the one that you're going to turn in next week. Does that make sense, everyone? So, but I just think it's going to be easier, less confusing for us to start from the beginning. So I'm going to ask you to go find a version copy of Sunny. So she was in week 3. And I'm simply going to open it up. Now, when I open mine up, and I think this was the way the original one ran, there's a white background layer that's sitting underneath this. There's no reason to have that there. So a shortcut for merging things down, if you select the Sunny that's actually on the top and hit Command E, it will actually merge down. Command E will merge down no matter where you are in the stack. So it's just a quick way to sort of get clean things up a little bit, for lack of a better way of putting it. Now, I leave this layer locked. I'm going to actually do a new version of this because this is my safety layer right here. You can see that there is a lock on it. So I'm going to hit Command J, and Command J simply gives me a copy of this that has no locks on it. Now, there are various other locks that you can actually use on an image, and they sit right up here, up at the very I take it back. We're not going to get into locks right. Well, we'll get into locks really quickly. So these locks that run across the top right here, the first lock is transparency. So if you had some transparency in your image, I take it back. Let's look at locks later because I want to really show them to you, and so we might as well have transparency, and then we'll take a look at what all of these are. So okay. So first things first. You guys are making this shit so hard on yourselves. How many of you, the challenge of this was the hairline against the skin tone, right? And how many of you went in and tried to actually get this skin that was right back into here? Why? Well, because I told you to. That was part of the assignment, right? For me, I would never ever go after that. That's way too hard, right? So how would I not have to go after that? How could I fix this so I didn't have to go after it? Remember, you are retouchers. So everybody say this. Everybody hold up their right hand. Say, I as a retoucher, promise verser, I will be the best liar that I can possibly be. Because that's what retouching is all about, guys. So I'm going to start off the bat. I don't want this to be a challenge for me, so I'm going to get rid of it. So, number of ways of doing this. The first, and the way most people would actually know to do this, is they would actually just clone stamp this away. So again, I am going to go to my tablet. I'm going to hit the S key to get the clone stamp tool. Whenever, again, you hit any of those keys, if you don't know can't remember to hit the S key, again, it's the tool that's sort of right in the middle of your tool palette. And there are two tools in here. There's the clone stamp tool and the pattern stamp tool. I am going to pick the clone stamp tool. It is a brush, so I'm going to click on the drop-down menu again up in my options palette to check the quality of my brush. Typically in clone stamping, most people work with a 50% edge. If you work with a 100% hard edge, the problem that you run into is that you can really spot the before and after where the clone, where the replacement was. You get this really hard edge. If you do it at a completely 0, you run into the opposite problem. So what happens at 0 when you're actually cloning is that as that edge starts to fade, so again, it's a very soft brush, as you start moving from the center of the brush out to the edge, it starts to fade. By definition, what's happening is as the new pixels begin to fade, the old pixels show through, and you end up mixing both of those textures together, which just by definition destroys them both. Does that make sense to everybody what I'm talking about? So again, the problem with a soft edge, this is why we don't use these tools to do really serious retouching, is it because they mix textures. So again, as you're using a clone stamp tool, as you start nearing the edge of that brush, if it's a completely soft brush, some of the texture of the original image starts to show through, and that's why the two blend together. But you're not just blending tone and color, you're blending texture, and all of a sudden you'll have hair that's moving in one direction mix with hair that's going in another direction, and the two, neither one of them is true. They are a blend of both of them together. And really good retouchers can spot that a mile away, and I'm a really good retoucher, so I can spot it a mile away. So, but at any rate, 50% is probably a good spot to be in. I'm going to get my drop-down menu to go away. I'm going to leave this as a normal blending mode, 100% opacity, 100% flow. Flow and opacity are two other things that people will actually use when they're actually doing a clone stamp tool, which again is a problem. If you drop your opacity down to 50% and then start cloning over something, what you're saying is that I want to keep 50% of the old texture and I want to add 50% of the new texture. And those combination, pushing those two things together is never, ever, ever going to look real. So that's just not a way to do it. It's a way people cheat in the very beginning and they think it looks good, and then you delude yourself that it really does look good. And the truth of it is that anybody who knows what they're doing can spot it right away and just say, yes. No, I am not using any of those. So again, the tablet pressure parts, to get to them, if you click on your drop down for your brushes, depends on your setup. I'm going to scroll up to the top of mine. If you open up, so I've gotten my drop down brush menu. If you open up to the very top, the general brushes in the very beginning, do you have this series of circles that run along the top? Okay. What these represent are the first 6 of the brushes that exist. So the first 6 of the brushes that exist, if we click on the first of the, so I've just opened up the general grouping of brushes. If we click on the first one, you can see it makes your brush completely soft, and size is not something that's controlled by this drop-down menu. You control that separately, either using the slider or your bracket keys. If you go to the next brush down, all it does is change the hardness up to 100%. If we scroll down here and go to the next one down, this is what you're getting here is a completely soft brush, but the pressure on your tablet controls how large or small the brush is. If you go to the next brush down, you get the very same thing, except it's a hard edge. A hard edge, but again, pressure controls the size of the brush. If you go to the fifth brush down, at this stage of the game, if we click on it, again, it gives you a completely soft edge brush, but now the size remains consistent, but what pressure does is it changes its opacity. So the harder you press, the more opaque it becomes. The lighter you press, the less opaque it becomes. And then finally, you get that same option again with the 6th brush down, is that it's a completely hard edged brush. Pressure does not control size, it controls the opacity of your brush. So that's basically what's going on. My suggestion to you guys is to only use, especially when you're first starting out with graphics tablets, only use these first two, either the hard brush at the very top or the soft brush at the very top. Do not use tablet pressure. We can emulate tablet pressure here in just a second in the way we ultimately set these brushes up. But for the time being, I'm going to say do not use either of any of the tablet pressure sensitive parts of it. So I'm going to go back to my general brush at the very top. Again, these options only give me either 0% or 100%. I'm going to drag mine over to about a 50% because that's basically where I want to control this. Again, to get rid of that flyout menu, click on the near the word that's actually Adobe. And let me try that one more time because I had a different tool selected. So going across the top, again, I've still got my clone stamp tool. Across the top, we have actually got normal blending mode. Again, if you click on the drop down for blending modes, we have blending modes for a clone stamp tool, just like we've been using a blending mode brushes, the overlay brush, to restrict areas that we were painting in when we were refining our masks. All that is still an option for you right here. Then we have opacity. I would say keep opacity at 100%. You can actually add tablet pressure right here as well. And that's what the little, it looks like, for me it always looks like a target with a little arrow on it. That's actually to invoke opacity using your pressure on your tablet. I'm going to say please don't use that, leave it off right now. Flow, which is right next to it, is also, I'm going to ask you to leave that at 100%. And then finally there is an Airbrush tool in here which adds another dimension to the way flow actually works. It's tricky how they actually do this, but let me ask you guys this right now. How many people in this room know the difference between opacity and flow? Well, then we should deal with that right now. I need everybody to create another blank, brand new file, Command N. It can still be the same 8x10 file that we did. You can still leave the original Sunny up there. I'm going to double click on the hand to get it as big as I possibly can. I'm going to hit the B key to just get a brush. In this case, just so that you can see the real edge quality of it, I'm going to make this a completely hard brush. So I'm going to click on the drop down menu, drag my hardness all the way over to 100%. I'm going to change my overlay mode, because that's where I was, to normal. I'm going to set my opacity at 100% and my flow at 100%. And I'm going to hit the D key to default my foreground and background colors to black and white. If black is your background color, hit the X key to make it your foreground color. And then up at the very top of my image, I'm simply going to click and drag across. And it paints a solid black line with very, very, very sharp edges. If I change the quality of that brush to 0% hardness, so again, I just clicked on the little brush drop down. I'm going to drag the hardness all the way down to 0. Click on the Adobe Photoshop Word to get the flyout menu to go away, and click and drag across again. You can see what a soft edge brush does. So this is the difference in hardness and softness. If I go to a 50% hardness for my brush, what it'll end up doing is giving me something exactly between the top one and the bottom one. You can see it's nowhere near as soft as the bottom one, or the middle one now, but it's much, much, much softer than the top one at the very top. So if you've done all of this, great. I want to start pretty much over, so you can go back up in history till to get rid of all of those, or simply refill your background with white. I'm going to go back to a completely hard brush because it's simply easier to see it. So 100% hardness on this brush. And I'm going to drop my opacity now down to 50%. So I want everybody to do this part with me. And I want to do an exact 50% just so that you can see what's going on. If you can't get an exact 50% using your scrubby slider or the drop-down menu, you can actually just select the value and type it in and hit the Enter key, and you'll have a perfect 50%. So watch my screen really quickly. I want you to watch, and then I want you to do it on your own. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the left-hand side, and I'm going to start to, sorry, I did a bounce on that one. So I'm going to click on this side, drag over, and then I'm just going to start dragging back and forth. And I'm just going to go back and forth. I'm going to try to stay relatively close to my lines. And you guys can go ahead and do this right now. And what you'll see is it's actually laying down a 50% gray, but what you also should be seeing is that once you've laid down that 50% gray, that 50%, so again, it's 50% of black, my foreground color, and that's why we're getting this middle gray. You do not add any more density to this at all. However, if you then take your cursor off of your tablet or let go of your mouse, or however you release this, and then start the same process again, you will see that you do indeed build density. But the trick to it is this. I want everybody to look at my screen here really quickly. When I did the first stroke, which is this gray down here at the bottom, what it did was it looked at the color of my brush, which was black, and the color of my background, which was white, and it said, okay, 50% right in the middle of those two. That's where we're going to go. And that's why I got a 50% gray. And you can see as I hover over that gray, the first gray that got laid down, indeed, I do get 127 in my info readout, which is the perfect middle gray. However, when I did my second stroke, the way opacity works is it looks at the foreground color, and then it looks at the color you are painting on, and it goes halfway in between that. So again, black was my foreground color at 0, but my color that I was painting over was already 127. Half of that becomes like 62. And again, that's exactly what my info palette is telling me. If I hit my brush again and I paint over this one more time, I still have not gotten to black. Again, it's now 50% of that 62 or 63, which now takes me down to 31. If I hit it again, it is still not completely black. This is the way you need to think about opacity. Most people think that, oh, it's set to 50% opacity. If I did 2 strokes, it would be completely black. That is not what happens at all. It's always looking to do the halfway between the color you are painting and the color you are painting it on. Now, eventually, if we do this like a whole bunch of times, eventually you will get down to 0. In theory, you never really do get to 0, but eventually Photoshop gives up on it. And so that's basically the way opacity works. In some of our earliest retouching, we are going to use opacity over flow. Opacity is easier to control. It doesn't take off, it doesn't get out of hand. And I'll show you what I mean by that with flow. So I'm going to actually say, let's take the opacity back up to 100%. I'm going to double click on the hand. Again, I'm going to hit the B key as a brush, make sure it's 100% opacity. I'm going to take my flow down, but this time I'm going to take it way down. I'm going to take my flow down to like 5%. You'll see how 4 or 5%, it doesn't matter. Something as long as you're down in that range. And now I want you to do the exact same thing that we just did before. I want you to start to drag across, and then I want you to come back. And then I want you to keep going back and forth. And you can see that flow never requires you to lift your cursor up off of it. Flow is building density over time. That's why they actually call it flow. And you can see that after a while, I can actually get to 0 pretty quickly. If we crank flow up a little bit more, I'll bring it up to like 20. Again, keep my opacity all the way up. And we'll bring it down to like 20 here. You can see as you start to scrub faster, it goes in really quickly. So you can see that I'm immediately get to 0 almost too fast. The trick to using flow is to use incredibly low ones. Most people work, depending on what you're really trying to do, end up working in that 1 to 3 to 4% range. That's where you'll end up being, so don't be scared to get down that far. Does that make sense, the difference in these two? Okay, you can close that guy up. You don't need to save it. Okay, so back to Sunny. So on this first layer, I'm actually going to double click on the layer. And I'm going to rename it New Virgin. And the reason I do that is I need to make a distinction that this is not the Virgin that started with down here. That's the untouched one. That's my background copy and that's locked down here. But everything that I do from this point on, I want to work using this New Virgin. I don't want to do something specific just for like the hair that isn't the same pixel image that I use everywhere else. So I'm going to do the pixel retouching work first before the selection part of it. I'm going to zip back out a little bit. Hit the S key to get my clone stamp tool. Again, check on my drop-down menu, 50% hardness is perfect, 100% opacity, normal blending mode, 100% flow. And then I'm going to simply come over here to the side of her hair over here on the far left-hand side, make my brush a little bit larger, hold down the Option key and click once. That sets my source point. And then I'm simply going to come over to the side where the hair is poking through and click and simply paint down to cover all of that hair that's actually had all of that skin show through. Now I don't need to select that skin. If you hold down the Option key and click your source point, and then paint. So here, watch again. All right, so I'll zoom in and do it. To use the clone stamp tool, pick the tool first or hit the S key. Hover over your image. With the clone stamp tool, you pick the source first for the replacement. So I want to cover this hair, this area over here where it's a mixture of hair and skin. I want to cover that with all hair. So I'm going to come over here where I've got all hair. I'm going to hold down the Option key and click once. That now picks up that hair that's right underneath that spot. And when I come over here to the area where I want to cover it, and then I simply click and I can paint up and I can paint down and it replaces all of that hair mix, skin hair mix with hair, and I'm done. Did that work? Great, except what's my problem? Look at this image. What's the problem? Oh, totally, right? The number one shitty thing about retouching, or shitty retouchers, I should say, is you spot the pattern right away. Look at this little curl of hair right here. It's identical to this little curl of hair right here. You pick up repeating patterns when you actually do clone stamp work. Now, there are ways that we can throw that off. There's ways that you can actually change that relationship. I find that onerous. So for me, there's a different and better way of doing this, and it's what I'm going to show you guys right now. So I don't do this because you do pick up the repeating pattern. So I'm going to go back in time. Command Z if you did it all in one stroke. Command Option Z if you need it in more than one stroke, and it'll actually just walk you back up through your history palette. So instead, I'm going to double click on the hand, and I do this a lot. I'm going to ask you to make a selection of this girl's hair. Do not make a tight selection of her hair. You need to select the entire left side of this girl's head and hair. So I'm going to hit the L key to get the lasso tool. I'm going to start right about in the middle of her forehead, and I'm going to drag all the way up to the corner, all the way out, all the way back down into her sweater, and then come back up again. I am not leaving any possible hair behind because I don't know if I'm going to need it. I don't really know ultimately how this is going to work out. But again, what I do know for certain is that if you picked a relatively small amount of hair thinking you'll have enough to actually fix to create the patch, and in all likelihood you won't, which means you have to start the whole process over again. So I over-select, I guess is all I'm trying to say. I'm going to jump this to its own layer, Command J. And then I'm going to hit the V key, which gives me the Move tool, or pick the very top tool that's on the very top of your tool palette, and we can move this. And I'm going to simply click on this patch area, and I can move it. And you can see as I start to move it, I can sort of guess where I'm going to need to put it on top of that. The problem is, if you take a look at my screen, this is exactly just as bad as I had before with the clone stamp tool. Look at this curl right here. It's sitting right here again. It's just a repeating pattern. So what I need to do is I need to break that relationship. I need to change what I'm going to call this now the patch layer. I need to change how that patch layer works. So I am going to zip all the way back out. My first always when I'm actually doing this kind of work is to rotate the patch. So we're just going to call this guy the patch right now. As a matter of fact, double click on that layer 2 and rename it patch. So I'm going to hit Command T. If you can't remember Command T, it's up at the Edit menu down under Free Transform. That's where the little command keyboard shortcut will be actually shown to you. But Command T for Transform. And as soon as that happens, you actually have a bounding box that's around your image. Does everybody have this little target that sits right in the middle? Does anybody not have that? If you don't have it, look up at your options palette up at the very top. Just past the little house, there is a sort of it looks like a independent set of little squares with a dot in the middle, and right next to it, a place to put a check mark. Put a check mark in there and you will get this center dot. This center dot's really critical to us through all of our transforming here. This used to be the standard practice. They've changed it. It's no longer visible. We need it. So you can just leave that guy checked. So if I come inside the bounding box, you will see that I get my cursor turns into a black arrow and I can move around. It's just like the Move tool. However, if you come outside the bounding box, you will see, so I'm down on her sweater somewhere, you'll see that your cursor turns into a handle that's got arrows pointing in 2 different directions. This allows you to rotate your selection. So I'm simply going to click and drag to the left, and you'll see we are rotating the image. Now, the minute I rotate that image, I have broken the pattern that I was fighting before. Because the little curl that's sitting right here is not exactly in the same orientation as the original one. However, for me, that's not enough. I also want to distort this more. I want this patch to look like its original hair. So I'm going to stretch it out longer. I'm going to come to the control handle at the bottom of the bounding box, and I'm going to click there, and I'm going to drag out, and you'll see I'm stretching the hair out now. Again, I'm breaking up the similarity of the original hair with this new patch. And then finally, I'm going to crush this thing. I'm going to push the hair in tighter against itself by clicking on one of the bounding boxes on the side and just pressing in. And I'm not going wild or crazy here, but you can see I've radically distorted this patch, which is what I want to do. And this gives me new hair that I can actually work with. Does this make sense to everybody what's going on? Are we good on this part? So then to go ahead and commit your transform, if you look at the very top, you can either hit your return and enter key, or you can simply click on the little check mark that's at the very top in your options palette. If you wanted to undo this, you would click on the circle with a little slash going through it. But this is the patch that I want to, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK to that. And then, again, I can hit the V key just to get the move tool to sort of like move it around. The problem I run into now, though, is I don't know really where to put this, because when I put the patch over the area of the hair that I want to fix, I can't see it anymore. So it doesn't matter. Just put it in this general area. Just try to cover it with some hair. Don't worry, we are going to finesse this later. So, yes?
When I try to move my box, it just makes it bigger. Like it doesn't...
Let's see.
Like it just gets bigger either way.
Yeah. It looks like you've got this. Click on that link. It looks like it's locked. Yeah, now it'll move.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So at this stage of the game, and this is just the way I retouch. Other people will do the exact opposite of this, but it's the way I retouch. I want to add a black layer mask to this. I want to hide all of this patch. To do that, hold down your Option key and click on the Add Layer Mask. So I just held down the Option key down and clicked on the Add Layer Mask, the little icon at the bottom of my Layers palette, and it adds a black layer mask. That's not the only way to do it. I'm going to throw mine away. The other option that you can do, again, I'm going to delete it. The other option you could do is simply add a regular layer mask. So simply click on the little Add Layer Mask icon that's at the bottom of your Layers palette. You get a white one on there, and then simply hit Command-I to invert it, and it is a black layer mask. Finally, there's one last way to do that. Throw that layer mask away. Again, we're going to do the same thing by adding just a regular layer mask on top of this. It's a white one, so it shows so the patch is all showing through. But if you look in your Properties palette now, because you have got the little brackets around the layer mask, the Properties palette controls the mask, and you can see there is an invert button down at the very bottom. Click on that, it will also invert the layer mask. So some way, get a black layer mask on there to hide this whole thing. Then I'm going to zoom in to the area that I do need to actually fix. I'm going to hit the B key to get a brush and make it a little bit smaller. I'm going to check this brush, because this brush is going to function for me like the Clone Stamp tool did. You don't want to use 100% hardness on this because you'll spot the edge. You don't want to use 0% hardness on this because you will blend old texture with new texture. So I'm going to split the difference and come in at around 50% for the hardness of this brush. Make sure that your blending mode is normal, 100% opacity, and 100% flow. And then I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller. And then I'm working on my layer mask to reveal the patch that's underneath. And you simply want to paint the area that you know needs to have hair in it. Now, you may or may not see hair depending on the pixel layer that's underneath it. Don't worry about that right now. I just want you to paint across the area where you know we need to actually add hair. So I'm going to go over all of this. I'm going to leave the edge a little loose. I'm not going to try to hit everything on that far edge, but I actually am going to try to trace the line that's sort of like coming down here in that area. And that part looks pretty good to me. So I'm looking at this now, and you could say, well, okay, that's fine, but take a look at my screen. I don't know if you can tell, like right in this area right in here, it's still a little bit thin. I'm still seeing hair through that. The mask is in the right spot. It's just that the pixel layer that is underneath it is not in the right spot. So we can break the link between those two and move them independent of one another. But before we do that, I want everyone to look at their mask right now by itself. So hold down your Option key and click on the layer mask. And you can spot problems in your mask, like I can spot in mine right now. And the problem that I see in mine right now is that at the very, very top, I'm starting brand new hair about 1/4 of an inch before I actually hit the top frame of my image. That means I've got old hair that's sitting right above brand new hair. My brand new hair is starting in the middle of nowhere. That's not a good idea. So while I'm still working on my layer, I don't even see my image. I know I need to clean this all the way out so that it goes all the way out to the top of the image. So now, at least with my patch, it will be starting outside of my image, come all the way in, do the work it needs to do, and then I need to worry about what's going to happen down here at the bottom. I don't know if I need to carry it all the way out again, but the thing that you do not want to do is you do not want to all of a sudden start brand new hair in the middle of somebody's, in the middle of somebody's head. All of a sudden you've got brand new hair that's shooting some other direction. Does that make sense? You'll spot it every time. Is everybody good on this part? All right. So I can click on the pixel layer so I can see the entire thing right now. So I feel like my mask is in a good position, but I don't know that I really like the hair that's underneath it. Now, if I simply hit the V key to get the move tool and move it, it moves everything. It moves it moves the mask, and it moves the pixel content as well. That's not what I want to do. I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. Instead, if you look between the pixel content of that layer and the mask, you'll see that there's a little chain link. If you click on that chain link, it goes away. We have now broken the link between the mask and the pixel content, the hair part of the image. And you can move either one independent of the other. So I'm going to select the pixel layer right now. So I've got the little brackets that are around the small part of hair that was the girl. I'm going to move it. The mask is not going to move, but the pixels are. So again, hit the V key to get the move tool, and you can now move this around to see if you can find a better fit for what's actually going on. And you can actually move stuff considerably around. That's why I said that you really needed to pick as much much of that hair as you possibly could. So I need everybody to look at my screen again really quickly. At this stage of the game, even though I've distorted it, twisted it, and done everything else, that one really obvious curl that's got the highlight on it is showing up again right here. I can actually break that by simply moving it down a little bit in my layer mask, and I might even actually be able to push this over slightly. And now I get a really good patch on here, but I don't have a repeating pattern in here. And it's just simpler to do it this way. So that's basically how I'm going to approach mine. And I feel like that part's actually looking pretty well. If I want to see where this thing ends to make sure I don't have some clunky ending on this, Command click on your layer mask and it'll show you. I'm bringing my mine almost all the way down here to the very bottom. So I know that I'm actually in good shape right here. Command D to deselect on that. This image actually looks pretty good to me. So at this stage of the game, I want to go ahead and commit this into my retouching layer. So again, with this top layer selected, hit Command E or Control E, and it will merge it down into your new version. And I'm going to recall this new version because when I went back in history, it undid the naming. And at this stage of the game, I would save your work. So when you come up to do save your work, I'm going to come into my file menu. I'm going to come down and do a save as. My window will actually fly open. You guys should plan on putting this wherever you want to save stuff for your homework. I have a thing called toss volume where I just throw temporary stuff. So I'm going to put mine in my toss volume. Again, in the format drop down right here, you can click on this drop down format. You'll see this is a recent change in Adobe Photoshop. It has to do with the way Apple has designed their dialog boxes right now. So in a dialog box, a Save As dialog box, Apple shut down the feature that allowed you to be able to save your files as anything other than either a Photoshop file or a TIFF file or a PDF. If you want to save this as something other than these 4 formats right here, you need to click on this Save a Copy. And when you click on the Save a Copy, it will open up another dialog box, and then you will get all of these options so that you can save it as something else. For this class, we only save stuff as either Photoshop files and or TIFF files. Those are the only 2 options that will keep everything that we need to have intact. TIFFs support layers, they support embedded profiles, they support 16-bit, they support everything. So you don't need to worry about if you're doing either TIFF. You can do some compression on a TIFF file, but it's not really, to be honest with you, it's not, in my opinion, worth the effort to actually go through doing it. So at any rate, I'm simply going to save this as a Photoshop file in my TOS folder. And say OK to that. So right away, I need everybody to come over to their History palette and scroll up to the very top. And at the History palette at the very top now, you should have 2 little icons that sit up at the very top. The first one is right here, and it says Sunny Copyright Jason Stitt PSD. And right underneath it, you should have a second copy of it that has a timestamp. Who does not have the timestamp? Wow, OK. So again, click on the little 3 lines that represent the drop-down menu for the History palette. Come down to History Options and make sure you have this set up. We did this class 1, day 1. Automatically create new snapshot first. Automatically create first snapshot is checked by default. Automatically create new snapshot when saving. You don't have checked, and you need to have it checked. You do not want to do nonlinear history. You do want to show new snapshot dialog by default, and then you do not necessarily, making layer visibility changes undoable. I'm going to leave that off as well and say OK. Now when you actually save a file, so we're just going to save this again, up to the File menu, come down and do a Save. You will now notice if I scroll up the top, I now have 3 of those little guys. Each one, the last 2 are time-stamped. This is a godsend for you. We only have 50 history states. You can blow through 50 history states really quickly. If you get into the habit, though, of saving repeatedly, often, what you'll see is you will have, these are snapshots of what your image looked like when you actually did the save, and they're time-stamped. So let's say you're into an 8-hour retouching session, and all of a sudden you realize you have done something horribly wrong. You actually moved one of your layers, and it's no longer in register with any of the others, and there's no way to get it back. In normal cases, you would have to start the process all over again. You would have to start your retouching from scratch. With this time-stamped history, what you can do is you would first, right off the bat, you would go back through all of your history, your 50 history states first, hoping that the move that you made that screwed up your image wasn't that long ago. You know, if you were lucky, oh, that was only 10 steps ago and I'm lucky, right? But the reality is that that mistake could have happened 2 hours ago. As you start going back in these history states, you'll find out where it is, so at least you do not have to start the process completely over. This thing has saved me so much time. When things go bad, you can't believe it. Does this make sense to everybody what's going on? All right. So now I've at least got a new version to work with. Yahoo. Okay, what's the single most difficult thing to select in this? Well, there's a number of trouble things too. But when I look at this image, for me, the most obvious thing, or difficult thing to select is the background, the blue background. Now, as it turns out, the transition from her hair to her skin is also really, really, really challenging. But I typically go after the most difficult thing first. And so that's what we're going to do right now. So I want to select a blue background. I want to make a mask that shows me just the blue background. Everybody on board with this? We good on this part? So I'm going to start looking at channels. That's how I'm going to approach the beginning of this. So I'm going to look at my red channel. And again, what I'm looking for is the challenging part. Forget about the inside of her face. Forget about the inside of her sweater. Forget about the inside of her hair for that matter. None of that shit matters. When it goes to making selections, the things that matter are the edges. It's the transition from hair to background, the transition from a sweater to background, the transition from sweater to skin. Those are the things that we need to worry about. The middle of her face, I don't care about this, so ignore that. What I am looking for now to build the mask for this background is as much contrast between the hair and the background that I can find. So the darker the hair, the lighter the background, or the darker the background, the lighter the hair. It doesn't really matter. It's just which is more extreme contrast than the other. When I look at the red channel here, it does not do a lot for me. These things look really close. I'm going to go down and look at the green. The green is far better. You can see that the background actually got lighter and the hair got darker. So the green's actually certainly better than the red. And then finally, I'm going to select the blue. And the blue is the best one yet. In the blue one, the background is almost white. The hair is still really dark. So the blue is where I'm going to start trying to do my first separation. So I'm going to make a copy of the blue channel. So in the channels palette, grab the blue channel and simply drag it right down to the little square underneath it at the very bottom to make a copy of the blue channel. And you'll see it makes this thing and it's called Copy Blue Channel. I'm going to double click on the name and rename it, and I'm going to call it Blue Background Knockout. Blue Back Knockout will be enough. And that's what I'm going to start to work on. So I'm going to zoom in to this giant curl that's right. If you think of her face as as this clock face, I'm right about 3 o'clock. There's this one giant curl that's actually shooting out. And I need everybody to look up at my screen. Well, you can sort of look at your version of it as well. So it's this big curl. It's the one curl that sticks out into the background as far as anything else. If we look at the bottom part of this curl and also think of it as a clock face, you can see that the area that's right around noon is dicey. It's going to be really hard for me to pick a point on that because the hairs are so thin and fine out there, and I get a lot of background that's really, really close to it. As I get to 2 o'clock, I've got a much more solid area, but again, it's really, 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 really small. I don't necessarily trust myself to actually hit that. As I start to come around, I want you to look at around 5 o'clock. You will actually see that the hair gets a little bit lighter there than anywhere else. That makes me nervous because the thing about hair is transparent. Now, if you bunch a whole bunch of hair together, it no longer becomes transparent. But when it gets spread out like this, light can actually come through hair. And you guys all know this. Anybody in this room ever done a backlit picture? Anybody in here ever use a hair light? Well, the reason you get that shine, the reason you get that glow is because there's light that's actually coming through the hair. And that's what happens in these situations right here. So I need to avoid those spots. Those things that are transparent need to remain transparent. So if I pick this spot, that's the 5 o'clock spot on this one that should be transparent, and I make it black, which I can do, it's going to be too aggressive. I actually need hair, I need light still coming through this. Does this make sense to everyone? So the trick to this is to find the things that you know for certain that you need to be in one place or another. So I'm going to continue around that circle till I get around the 7 o'clock area right in here. And I don't know. It might be an area that should be completely black. It might not. It might be the very same as it's not as bad as the 5 o'clock, but I'm not really certain here. If I get to the area that's around 9 o'clock over here, that really dark spot, I know that that should be black, but that thing is almost already black. So if I continue on the spiral up that hair, I can see that there's this one sort of vertical column of hair in here that I feel very confident should be completely solid black. It is a heavy hunk of hair, and I'm just feeling like this is my guess. Does that make sense to you guys, what I'm going for? So I'm going to put a color sampler point right there. So again, over to your tools palette, click on the eyedropper, come down and grab color sampler tool, and I'm going to drop one right in the middle of that guy right there. Now, When you're doing this work, I know that I'm going to make the hair dark, but you need to think about it this way as well. Just below the spot that I put, there's a much darker area of hair. Just above it is also a much darker area of hair. If I pick the spot above it, look at my screen right here. If I move my cursor up to here and let go up here, I'm going to change my readout so that we can get Rgb Readout, so we'll see what we're talking about. Up in this area right in here, it's like a 52. But if I bring it down here into that first spot that I said I wanted to actually pick it, you can see it actually hits 72. It's a little bit lighter. If I pick the lightest area that I know should be black and make it black, anything that's already darker will have already gone to black. So I'm picking this point here that says 72. If I get that down to 0, the spot above it that was darker, that was at 52, will have gotten to black before this spot where I am right now. If I do the reverse, if I use this point up here that was in the 52s and I get it to go black, the area that's in the middle that should be black will not be black. It'll be in the 20s. It'll be close, but it won't be there. Does this make sense to everyone? So the trick to doing this well is understanding the points to pick. So I'm going to move this back down into that middle area right in there. I feel good about that. And then I simply pick a spot out in the background. I like to stay close to where my first spot is, but you just need to make sure that whatever spot you pick on the background does not have any hair. There's no flyaways, hairs. There's nothing that's coming out here. So I'm simply going to drop another point out there. I've got 2 points now in my info palette. The first one I've already changed to read RGB. And I changed that by simply clicking on the eyedropper right under the number 1 and saying I want it to be RGB. And then I'm going to do the same thing for my spot number 2. Click right on the eyedropper that is number 2 and pull it down to read RGB color. And now I've got what I essentially need to do with this image. I need to actually get the 76s, which are representing her hair, to 0, and the 214s, which represent the background, to white. Is everybody with me? Okay, Command L brings up the level dialog box. You do not simply type in 76 and 214 into the white point and black point of this. You actually grab the black point slider just underneath the histogram on the left-hand side, and you start to drag it over. And what I'm watching is the after number readouts of my point number 1. Again, I want those 76s to equal 0. So as I continue to drag it over, I get close to 0 and stop. I'm at like 6 right now. Go to your arrow keys at this point. If you hit the down arrow key like I did and it gets to be a higher number, hit the up arrow key and get it to go down. You want to tap this in with the least number of taps that you can get to hit 0. You don't want to hit it one more. We are trying to make the least aggressive mask that we can make, but one that still does the job. So that got me to black on the hair part, which is good. Now I need to go after the white point for the background. So grab the white point slider. It's the white point that's right underneath the histogram on the far right-hand side, and start to drag it back. Again, watching the readout in my point number 2 till I get close to 245. I'm sorry, 255. I'm at 253 right now. Go back to my arrow keys and tap them in until I just hit 255. Now at this stage of the game, a couple things we need to do. The first one is you need to revisit the black point. There are times when you change the white point that it will actually change your black point as well, and you may have to readjust that guy to get it back down to 0. That's not the case in our setup right now, so I'm feeling good about this. Before I say okay to this, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. I want to see what the edge quality looks like. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key, the Command key, and the Option key to get the negative magnifying glass. And I'm just going to jump back out a little bit to really sort of see what's actually going on in here. Now I know I've got contamination that's in her hair. That part I'm fine with. I can fix that part later. What I'm really looking for is this really feathery edge quality that's sitting up here on the top. Use your preview checkbox that's in the levels control and you turn it on and off, and you can see, are you killing too much of this background? I'm going to zoom back into this guy again. So I'm using my preview on and off, and I'm keeping beautiful little bits of background through here. So I need everybody to look over my screen because I don't want you to screw this up. But look at this area right in here. This is background area. You can see if I turn my preview off, this is background area that should be showing through. If I was too aggressive with my mask, look what happens. That's all blocked up. This is a mask that is far too aggressive. Take a look at it. You might feel like, well, wow, this is doing me, I don't have to go in here and do any brush work at all. This is like perfect. But this mask here is so aggressive that I'm losing that feathery background. I'm losing the background that's coming through that hair, which ruins the mask for me. So again, I'm just going to drop this off till the point that I'm actually getting tone there again. And I'm just going to reset it using my arrow keys. And I should be pretty good to go. So I feel good about this. I've tried my preview on and off, whatever. I'm feeling good about this, so I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. I'm going to double click the hand, and I'm going to check to see what happened with my work. So the first thing I'm going to do, it does not matter what cursor you use. If you have the hand, it doesn't matter what tool you are using right now. Your readout up at the top in your info palette will always tell you what's going on. So I'm looking at this area by her shoulder. It's all at 255. That's all great. But look what happens when I get up into the top right-hand corner. I'm now getting a value of 249 up in there. That tells me there's tone still up there, that is not white. I need to clean that part out. I'm also going to check on the background that's above her left shoulder between her hair. And as I start to just, move around in there, I'm getting all 255s in there. So the background is clean everywhere except for this top right-hand corner. So I'm going to zoom into the top right-hand corner and fix this problem. So brush key, again, the B key. I need to protect work that I've already done in here, so I'm going to change my blending mode to overlay. Again, you can see right now I've got an overlay brush. It's set to white. I've got, sorry, that's set to soft light, overlay. It's set 100% opacity, 100% flow. If I actually try to paint right here on her black hair, nothing happens because overlay is a contrast brush. It is a protective brush. So again, I use that to try to restrict the moves that I make to this light background without impacting the hair at all. Now, there's going to be some inevitable hair impact, but I'll show you how to deal with that right now. So I'm feeling pretty good about this. What I don't feel good about is that I want to do some close work up here at the very top of her head by the hair that's up here. But every time I get my brush where it should be, my brush turns into a cursor again. So I need to get to the pasteboard in order to continue to work outside of this. So you hit the F key once. We are now on the pasteboard. I can actually now move this around. There is something really wrong with my computer because I'm also holding up rulers on this and they shouldn't be there. So I'm temporarily going to get rid of my rulers, but you don't need to do that. Anyway, now I can use my brush completely outside the pasteboard so that I can work lightly on this area coming into her hair. If I hover over this area coming in really close to her hair, you can see that I'm in like a 250, so I don't really have a whole lot to do in here. But I'm not going to be able to come in here and paint this thing perfectly around this. So this is what I do. Watch my screen. I'm going to show you the way I would approach doing this. So my first move is to make this a completely soft brush. So I'm going to go down to 0% hardness, and then I'm going to make it a much larger brush. Again, what I'm looking to do is leverage the softness of the brush that's sitting out here on the outside. So with my brush sitting is really close to that top hair, I'm going to click on my tablet and drag away. And then I'm going to come into the next part right here. Click and drag away. Click and drag away. Click and drag away. You'll see that there's a little bit of damage it's doing to a few of those feathers, but for the most part, not too bad. And then by the time I get down here, level with just below her eye, whatever, I'm already back into the 255 range right here. So this has given me a border in here, and then I can simply use my brush to get rid of the rest of all of this part right in here. Yes?
My icon's not turning back into a brush. I'll hit click B, but it's giving me like a
Is your keycaps down? If you hit your keycaps down, guys, you lose the exterior of your brush. You just see the targeting center. Okay, so I'm going to double click on the hand right now. So this part is really good. It's built the edges that I need to build. What it hasn't built for me, the things that I'm going to have a problem with are this shoulder specifically. This shoulder is going to be problematic. I think the hands I can take care of pretty well. I think the shoulder over here I can take care of pretty well as well. So I'm going to go ahead and finish that work right now. So please do this with me. Let me reset my workspace to get that a little bit thinner. So I'm going to start on the left shoulder on the far side on the other side. Again, it's still overlay brush. I'm still working on my blue background knockout. The B key to get that overlay brush. At this stage of the game, I'm going to change it to about a 50% hardness. I'm not as concerned about the overspray. When I talk about overspray, what I'm talking about is if I'm painting here, well here, you guys can see this is what overspray would actually be. I'm going to change this back to a normal blending mode so you can really see it. And I'm going to make it a completely soft brush. So if I had it, and I'm going to make black my foreground color. I'm going to try to get this edge right here, but I'm doing it with a really soft brush. Watch what happens to the edge right here. So I'm going to try to paint this in right here, and you can see, look at all of that overspray that just shot into the background. All of that, that is a nightmare for us. So Command Z to undo that. Instead, using an overlay brush, I don't need to worry about that as much, but why make Photoshop work any harder than it already is working? I'm going to change this to a 50% hardness. So between the 50% hardness and the overlay brush setting, I think I can probably get that area exactly where I want it. So I'm simply going to start in here to get it to go black. But do not make this any more work than it already, don't make Photoshop work any harder at this than you already need to. All I'm trying to do then is establish this line. Do not worry about her fingernails. Don't worry about her face right now. I'm just trying to establish that line. And I've got that line. That part's actually working perfectly for me. I'm going to go over and look at the fingers on the right side. This is going to be my next problem area. I'm going to stay with my overlay brush. I'm going to stay with it at 50% hardness, but I've got to make it much smaller because, again, I don't want to paint outside these lines. But what I'm looking for here, again, look up at my screen, you can see I've got these darker edge lines that are on the outside of her fingers. Those will actually get black to me before even the center part does, which is great. Don't make the tool work any harder than you need to. So I'm simply going to trace that line. And again, I'm overlapping. I'm going a little bit out into my white background, knowing that overlay will protect that for me. Now, they gave me a reasonably good line, but if you hit it a second time, it will actually build more density for you, which makes it easier to do the next work later on. So I'm going to do the same thing with her hand. And once I get her hand down onto her sweater, I don't need to worry about that anymore. I'm going to go back, and her fingers going into her face, I don't need to worry about that. I'm only looking at edges. I've got a really good solid edge that's happening right on this middle finger. Where I don't have good edges is I don't have a really good edge on, it looks like it's her little finger that's sort of like right in the middle. I've got good skin, so you can actually hit the skin with an overlay brush and that part will be fine for you. But that tip of her fingernail is too precise, it's too sharp to paint that with a brush. So I'm going to hit that doing something else later. And then finally, this is about the blue background, and you can see that there is where her thumb is actually almost touching her face, there is part of the sweater is actually behind there as well. I can hit all of that with an overlay brush and then just leave the part, that small little part that's sitting in the background. This is blue background right here. So that little part, it will be fine. I'm also going to trace that part of her face that's right next to that. Then the area up along her cheek where, again, I'm getting up sort of towards that top finger, you need to be really careful about that line so that you keep all that beautiful hair that's mixing in the background in the back part as well. I'm going to get rid of all of that. I'm going to get rid of this. So all of this part is actually working out well for me. However, the tip of her fingernail, I'm going to zoom into the tip of her fingernail, hit the P key to get the pen tool, and I'm going to draw a path around this part of her fingernail. It doesn't need to be much, but I've actually got a path that's now right around the fingernail that I want to use and I need to fill this with black. I'm going to go to my path palette, You can see it's called work path. I don't need to save this. It's just a quick temporary thing to give me that fingernail. I'm never going to need to revisit this guy. If I thought I was going to revisit it, I would simply double click on work path and call it fingernail. And say OK, because that'll save it. To load this as a selection, hold down your Command key or your Control key on Windows. Click on this. It loads it as a selection. You see you get the marching ants. I don't want it to be a perfect pen tool selection. I need to soften it just a little bit. So up to the Select menu, down to Modify, down to Feather, and I'm going to put in like a 0.25, a quarter of a pixel feather, and say OK to that. So now I've got the marching ants. I'm still working on my blue background knockout because black is my foreground color and I've got an active selection. Option delete or option return will actually fill that with black. Command D to deselect, and I am good to go on this part. So I'm going to back out a little bit more to sort of see where things are going at here. And I'm feeling, yes? I'm sorry, did somebody? Okay. I'm going to do a little cleanup work here just to sort of orient us so that we know kind of where we're at. So to do the cleanup work, again, the B key to get a brush, change it back to a normal brush, make it a completely hard brush. This is the only way you can really guarantee that you're not going to have any overspray. And then I can simply paint these areas inside that already, I've built the outside lines for them. So I don't need to worry about staying inside those lines because I've already built them. So you need to paint inside the lines just like you did when you were 3. All right. I'm feeling pretty good about this hand. Again, I'm not going to worry about this shoulder on the other side yet. What I am going to worry about, though, is what in this hair is background and what in this hair is actually highlights that are on her hair. So I'm up into the, again, the area sort of where we started, our original points in here. And I think the majority of the ones that are sort of like close to her face are, for the most part, highlights. The ones that are actually the bigger ones that are starting to get out to the edge of the hair, for the most part, those guys I think are background. And you do not want, you want to keep those backgrounds coming through. That's what makes your mask look really believable. So to get to that part, number of ways of doing it. Come up to the very top of your channels palette and click, don't select the RGB channel, just turn on the eyeball. You'll get this red overlay on your image, and what the red overlay is just showing you is it's showing you the full RGB guy with also the eyeball of the knockout that you're making on here. That black ink becomes red so that you can see what's underneath it. That's the only reason it's actually done that way. If you uncheck the eyeball on your the knockout that we're working on, whatever, the red goes away. If you turn this back on, but nonetheless, it's a way to go in here and actually see what should be background and what should not be background. And you can see all of these areas on the edge. I've got blue background coming through. I want to save all of those. But the other areas, those highlights, I need to make them black. So I'm going to scroll up to the top. I'm going to turn off the eyeball for the RGB. I'm still working on my blue background knockout. You can see it's at the very bottom of my channels palette and it is highlighted. The rest of this stuff up here all needs to go black. Do not stay, you need to stay away from those edges. Those edges are all background that's showing through. But all this other stuff down in here, this is all background. And if you don't know whether it's background or highlights in her hair, you should go back up and check it again. But I know that all of this is good. All of that's good. I'm going to zip back out and take a look at the other side of her head. I know all of this on the other side of her face is solid black. There's no background showing through. So I can make my brush much larger and I can paint out all of that in the back. Stay away from the edges that you've worked so hard to fix. So again, I'll get down here like this, but then I'll stay away until I get to a smaller brush to see what's really going on down here. I'll make my brush a little bit smaller. That's all solid figure. So I'm going to double click on the hand right now. And in this case right now, you can see I've got a pretty fair amount. I can actually finish her face. I can actually do a large part of her sweater as well. But what I don't have is this other shoulder over here. So if we take a look at the right shoulder, this is where we've actually got a serious problem in here. And it was kind of by design. We knew when we were actually doing it, this was the weaker thing. But I said what we were really cared about was the hair. So I want to build this shoulder. This is the only thing that I'm really struggling with. The rest of it, I feel like I've got all of my edges. They look really good. I need to fill the rest of her body with black. But it's this one edge along here that's not, it's just not there for me right now. So how would you guys build this shoulder? It never changes, guys. The same tricks that we do for all of this, they just repeat themselves over and over and over again. We go look for a channel that has that edge. So I'm going to start up to the green, up to the red channel. Click on it. The red channel gives me a reasonable separation between the shoulder and the background. The green channel is far worse. The background got darker and the sweater got darker. They're both moving towards metal gray, so that's not contrast. And I'm going to look at the blue, and I know the blue is already bad because that's the one that I'm working with right now is a copy of the blue channel. So I know that the red channel is going to give me the best separation between the two, and I'm just going to do the exact same trick I've been doing all along. I'm going to make a copy of my red channel by dragging it down to the little square with the plus in it. I'm going to double click on that thing called red copy, and I'm going to name it Temp Right Shoulder. And say OK to that. I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to do again the exact same thing that I've been doing before. I'm looking for places to drop color points, to get readouts, to run levels on this, to get one to go black, one to go white. So I'm going to grab my color picker tool, color sampler tool, and I'm looking at this edge of her sweater right here, and you can see that there is a darker edge that's sort of look right into this valley right in here. As we start to get closer to the very edge, to the very top, it starts to get a little bit lighter. If we come to the other side of the sort of mountain over here, it's actually lighter than is this area right in here. So again, if I pick my area over here that's lighter and I get it to go white, the area that was darker will not have gotten to white. If I pick this area that's a little bit darker here and get it to go white, the areas that were lighter will have already gotten there. So I'm going to just drop a color point right down here on that sort of like lower scoop valley of her sweater. And then I'm going to get pretty far away from her, the sweater. This sweater's got a lot of fuzziness to it that I want to keep. So I'm not going to put anything really close to that. I'm going to come up here sort of to the top and put another color point right there. And then it's the same thing that we've done before. Command L to bring up the levels dialog box. I have now points number 3 and 4. You can see they're numbered. I need to change the readouts from K to RGB. So I'm going to click on the eyedropper tool and bring it down to RGB. I'm going to click on the eyedropper tool for my number 4 and bring it down to RGB. And now again, my goal is actually the flip side of what it was before. In the before version, I wanted the first point to go to black. In this case, I want my first point to go to white. It's just think about what are we trying to do with this mask? I'm trying to get the sweater to be white and the background to be black. They're already moving in that direction. It would be idiocy to try to make the background white and the sweater black right now. So that's going to be my goal on this. Point number 3 is sitting right here. It's reading a 204. Your number should be close. I'm going to grab my white point slider and start to drag it back, getting close to 255, but not quite there. I'm going to get close, 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 close. I'm going to stop at 251 and go to my arrow keys and just tap them in. I always pick the wrong arrow key. I always pick the one going in the wrong direction. It's only the up or down keys. I always pick the wrong one. And if you see the number going in the wrong direction, just pick the other one. And then I'm going to get my black point, which is my number 4s. I've got 188s that I need to get down to 0. So cranking way in. Back it off when you get close to 0. I'm at like a 27. When you start getting this contrasty, though, the numbers start to drop in relatively large increments. So just tap my way in. Now, what you can see here is that I've got a really fluffy, feathery edge at the very top. That's exactly what I want to keep. I don't want to lose any of that. That is the nature of that sweater. And if I can build that into my selection mask, all the better my mask is going to look. This is why we do things based on these luminosities. Go in and try to paint this thing with a brush and you will hate your life. So again, before I say okay to this, I'm going to use my preview on and off to see how I feel about this. And it feels really solid to me. It needs a little fix up, but not much. So I'm going to go ahead, if you want the same values that I put in there, and actually this is exactly what I told you guys before. Once I set my black point, my white point actually crept down a single point. So I'm going to go back to my white point and click it down one more arrow. I know that doesn't seem like a lot, but this is what separates you from the $9 an hour hack retoucher. So at any rate, I'm going to go ahead and say okay to this. Now this needs a little bit of work. For me, the readouts, the color readouts are always in my way. I'm going to do a little brush work on this, but I don't want to see these guys. So again, Command H will get rid of your extras. That's just, color readouts are extras. If you hit Command H again, they'll come right back again. So I just do Command H to hide them temporarily. There's a little bit of problem area right here on the bottom of that transition that I want to clean out. So again, I'm going to go to a brush. I'm going to make it an overlay brush. I'm going to make it a very soft brush. Actually, not very soft. I'm going to do about a 50% hardness because I really don't want a lot of overspray flying out. And I'm going to make it a much smaller brush. And then, well, not that small. And then this area that's right along here, I'm not going to click on the edge because I want to keep that fuzziness on the top. I just want to clean out a little bit of that stuff that's down at the bottom. So I'm simply going to click, and all of a sudden it goes darker, and I realize that black is my foreground color. So I hit Command Z to undo that, hit X to make white my foreground color, and then simply click and drag out. And we're just cleaning up that edge slightly. There's another small problem that's right along the second hump. And then I'm just looking on the rest of my way down, and everything, the rest of this all seems to be fine. Now, I'm not going to worry about the hand right now. I was really using this just to get this edge, but I can also see some contamination just above this. If you zoom in, that black background has got some noise that's actually coming through it as well. I need to get rid of that noise. So I'm going to hit the X key to get black as my foreground color. And again, I'm staying away from that fuzzy little transition area, but I can click on the bottom and drag up and still keep all of that fuzzy part in there. There's a little bit more here and here. Again, I'm only caring about the edges. Don't worry about the rest of her sweater or anything else. We're just trying to use this to build, yeah, there's a little bit more down in here too, just to build the edge of the sweater. I'm going to double click on the hand, and this is basically what I've got right here. And again, all I was trying to do was build this edge. So now this is the part that people lose sight of or track of. Actually, there's a small little bit, I think, right in here. And this is a judgment on my part. This is strictly an artistic judgment. If you take a look at her hand and you go to the first hump, as you come down into the second valley, I think that needs to be just a little bit cleaned out as well. So that's what I'm going to do. Back to the B key to get a brush. This time I'm going to check just to make sure it's 50% hardness. I'm good on that. I'm going to make white my foreground color, and then I'm simply going to tap this out just a little bit. And I feel like that's a little bit better. Okay. So then I need to actually put this together. And this is one of the things that people, you know this instinctively. If I load this thing as a selection, well, let's just see what happens if I load this as a selection. So I'm going to load it as a selection. How do I do that? Hover over the thumbnail, hold down the Command key or Control if you're on Windows, and simply click. Loads it as a selection, right? I'm going to ask you to go back into your layers palette now and just add a blank layer on top of this. I just want to show you what this selection is actually doing for us. So I'm going to turn off all the eyeballs so you don't see anything. All you can see is the marching ants. We're not going to save this. I just want you to see what's really happening here. If you hit the B key to get a brush, go ahead and make it a little bit larger. Make it a normal brush, normal blending mode, 100% opacity, 100% flow, and make black your background color. And then just come over here to the edge of her shoulder and start to paint. And you can see that the area that is selected will receive the ink. The area that is not selective does not receive the ink. Now, you guys, this is Photoshop 101. You guys, for your whole life using Photoshop, if you make a selection and you blur it, the area that was selected blurs, the area that was not selected doesn't blur. If you fill with a color, the area that was selected fills with the color, everything else doesn't. If you paint, it is protected. The area that is actually what is selected fills and what isn't doesn't. If you take, so that's what's going on here. You can throw this thing away. You can hit Command D to deselect. Come back to that temporary shoulder. So what happens is when you make a selection, areas, just like a mask, areas that are white become actively selected. Areas that are black are not selected at all. That's why this edge is allowing us to paint where the shoulder is, but not where the background is. Is everybody good on this part? Again, guys, you have got to spend your time with understanding how masks and selections essentially are the same thing. They function just the same way. It's just that active selection is white areas, black areas are not actively selected. Are we good on that part? So we're going to do the same trick, but we're going to use it on our layer to finish building our mask for the blue background. So I'm going to load this as a selection again. So hold down the Command key, click on the thumbnail for temporary shoulder, and then go to your blue background. And so this is our blue background knockout. This is the mask that we're actually going to be making on this guy. Hang on one second. Yeah, okay. And I'm going to zoom into this area of her shoulder. Now again, I don't like watching this with the marching ants. I like to see what's really going on here. So I've still got a brush, so the B key. Make sure that this is a completely hard brush. Actually, you don't need to make it a hard brush because if we spray into the hand's already black, so I'm okay with that. The selection will protect the background, so it doesn't really matter whether this is a hard or a soft brush. Make sure that your blending mode is normal, 100% opacity, 100% flow, and then simply, I'm going to, look at how big my brush is, and I'm going to drag right over the intersection of the edge between her sweater and the background. I'm going to click and realize as soon as I click that I've got white as my foreground color, which is a mistake. Command Z to undo it, hit the X key, and we're going to paint black, and I'm simply going to paint out that shoulder. Now, I need everybody to look at my screen really quickly first. Hang on one second. I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to hide the marching ants. Command H. They're still there, but watch what happens to this. I'm going to paint this, and you'll see it gives me that really beautifully feathered edge, which is exactly what I want. However, you already know if I go back over this a second time, it's going to actually make that transparent part even darker, just like it did when we painted overlay on the fingers. So watch what happens here. If I hit it a second time, it makes it darker, and that is not a genuine selection. So we don't want to compete. You do not want to repeatedly hit this. You want to hit this one time and leave it at that. Let the selection actually do its work. So I'm going to go back in history where they were both undone. I'm going to zoom out just enough so that I can see the entire shoulder. And with my brush, I'm going to paint along this in one continuous stroke. And then I don't touch that edge ever again. I can now come down here and paint the rest of this down to give myself a little bit of breathing room in here, but that's all I need to do. So Command D to deselect because you've still got marching ants going on here. I'm going to zip back out. And I feel like I've got pretty much everything in here that I really need to select and to have black. So the last part of it, the shortcuts. You can actually fill with black. If you're into painting, go right ahead and paint. You just need to paint in everything else in here that's not that background. For me, I like to be a little faster about that, so I'm going to hit the L key to get the Lasso Tool, and I'm simply going to drag around, staying inside those lines. Do not go outside those edges that you've built to select big areas that you know should be black. This whole area should be black. Black is my foreground color. Option delete, Command D to deselect. I'm going to go back to my brush just to make sure I've got a little bit of room down here on the bottom. And I do. And so now I can again go back to my, I'm going to zoom back out even more. Go to my Lasso tool, the L key, and simply drag through this whole area, all of which I know should be black. And black is my foreground color. Option delete, Command D to deselect, and immediately save your work. Once you save your work and you go up to the top of your history palette again, you'll see that we've got yet another timestamp of what my image looks like right now at 3:07. Are there questions about this? All right, really quickly, I just want to see how good a job we did. We'll take a quick break and we'll come back and we'll finish working on this guy. However, at this stage of the game, in your channels palette, you've got this temporary right shoulder. It's done everything it's going to do. I can't get anything else out of it. Housekeeping, throw that temporary right shoulder away. It's done everything it needed to do. It built me that shoulder. That's all I care about. To see how well we actually did on this, I'm going to simply Command click to load this as a selection. So hover over the thumbnail, hold down the Command or Control key, click to load it as a selection. I'm going to come over to my new version copy of this and I'm going to add it as a layer mask. Now I don't see anything because I've got all the eyeballs are turned off. But if I turn on the visibility of that layer, I can actually see it. If I zoom up here and actually take a look at what's going on up in here, something screwed up in that mask up there, and I have no idea why. So hang on, let me take a look at this. It's still there. All right. So, questions about this? Again, once I get to this stage of the game, I would invert my mask. So select the mask and hit Command I to invert it. You can sort of then spot to see if we have any problems in here. This is actually looking pretty clean to me. I've got spill in here, but that part's looking pretty clean to me. Hold down the Option key and click on the mask itself, and you can spot to see if there's any areas inside of this mask that have contamination in them. And I'm looking around and everybody's looking pretty good. Yep. Alrighty. So I've got 10 minutes after 3. If you guys can be back at 3:25, a hard 3:25, we got a lot to get through today. Are there questions about any of this so far? Yes? I'm sorry, you what?